Most of us have probably heard about Al Capone in one way or another. This person was and is still the most famous gangster in history, the King of Chicago, and the most powerful man in its history. So, let's watch today's video about Al Capone's history and learn about the exciting events that led him to the keys of power and wealth, and how his end was sad and tragic for the person who lived most of his life as the most powerful man in history. Today's video is about one of the most famous personalities in history, the leader of the great Mafia, Alfonso Capone, but he was known as Al Capone. Al Capone, since his childhood, had signs that his future would be different from any other child, even though his growth was very normal. His family was of Italian origins, like most mafias, and they moved to New York City in 1894. At that time, Al Capone hadn't been born yet. He was born there in New York in 1899. Al Capone's family was fairly large. He had 6 brothers and 2 sisters. The brothers, in particular, would be crucial to his career as a gangster because the Italian mafia is always familial. They prioritize family over all else, at least to some extent, because Richard, the oldest brother, would go on to become an officer and give up the Capone family name in order to distance himself from his brother Al Capone and the other brothers, who pursued careers in gangs and crime. Anyway, Al Capone, since his childhood, has shown signs that this boy is a different person. When he was young, he formed a gang with the other kids in their neighborhood to beat up the kids of the other neighborhood. Of course, their neighborhood was all made up of families of Italian origins, meaning it was an Italian neighborhood. There were always problems between them and the other neighborhoods, especially the Irish neighborhoods that had families of Irish origin. There were always problems between the Italians and the Irish, whether at the neighborhood level or even at the gang level. One of the things that happened to him when he was young was once a washboard was stolen from an old woman in his neighborhood by the Irish children. Al Capone gathered his gang, which was made of the kids of the neighborhood, and led them to get the washboard back from the Irish children. They went to their neighborhood and were able to bring back the washboard to the old woman. He made kind of procession in which he was bragging of his achievement. From a young age, Al Capone had a sense of leadership, but the problem was that he liked to show off, which is one of the things that would make him fall into great problems in the future. Another incident when he was young was a big turning point in his life. When he was 14 years old, there was a conflict or a misunderstanding between him and his teacher. He got mad at her and decided to beat her severely. After this incident, he was expelled from school, which was a big turning point in his life. After he had been expelled, he went to his parents and told them that he didn't want to study. He told them that school was not his cup of tea, and he wanted to live a realistic life instead. His parents didn't like his decision, of course, but they didn't have any other option. And at the time, Al Capone was stubborn. He only did what he wanted. What you have to know is that, at that time, Italian families in general were treated like they were poor. It is true that they weren't that rich, but they weren't poor as well. We can say that they belonged to the middle class. On the other side, there were the fancy areas, the areas where the members of Al Capone's family and people of the Italian immigrants were not allowed to enter. These were the areas where the noble and wealthy families lived. Al Capone used to see those people and start wondering, why am I not like them? Why are they the only ones who have all this wealth and money? How can I become like them? Al Capone was determined and wanted to achieve his goal of becoming a rich man by any possible means so he could prove himself in society. Indeed, Al Capone dropped out of school at the age of 14 and started working in normal jobs here and there. He worked in a bookshop, in a factory, and in a restaurant, but he couldn't stay in one job. He either got fired because of his violent behaviors or quit after getting bored. However, one of the jobs he found was guarding a bar called Harvard Inn. This bar belonged to a gangster named Frankie Yale. Frankie Yale was the gate through which Al Capone got into the world of gangs and organized crime, because it will be frequently repeated in the story. During Al Capone's work in this bar that was owned by Frankie Yale, he had an incident that left a big impact on his life. Literally a big impact on his face. One of Al Capone's nicknames that gave him great prestige was Scarface, because Al Capone had 2 large scars on the left side of his face. These scars were the effects of injuries caused to him by one of the people while working in the bar when he was 18 years old. What happened was that Al Capone saw a girl named Lena in the bar, and he liked her, so he tried to get close and flirt with her. He tried for the first time, but it didn't work. He tried again and said, "You have a nice butt, my dear." He said it in such a loud voice that everyone around him heard it. This girl's brother was with her, and when he heard what Al Capone said, he got angry at him, pulled out a knife, and started fighting with him. The fight ended with Al Capone being injured with 3 wounds, 1 on his neck and 2 on the left side of his face. These wounds left a permanent scar on the face of Al Capone that would accompany him for the rest of his life, and it would give him the nickname Scarface. During this period that Al Capone worked in the bar, he was considered one of the members of the Frankie Yale gang, and he was committing minor criminal acts here and there, but during that period he joined another gang. He joined a gang called the 5 Points Gang. This gang was led by a person named Johnny Torrio, who was one of the most important people in Al Capone's life. This person was like a mentor for Al Capone, and then Al Capone would become Johnny's right hand. They would climb the ladder of power and wealth together until, to some extent in the end, Al Capone would inherit Johnny's huge empire. When Al Capone joined Johnny Torrio and the 5 Points Gang, he began to commit more criminal acts and use more violence. During this period, he became a professional at using knives, pistols, and weapons in general. His affairs were just fine with his new gang, but then, when he reached the age of 19, a major change occurred in Al Capone's life. He fell in love with a girl named May Coughlin and decided to marry her. This girl was of Irish origins, and as we said, the Italians and the Irish always had problems between them, but their love was more powerful. Within a short period of time, they gave birth to their first son, Albert, and Al Capone's life entered a new turn, and he decided to stay away from gang life. He felt that he had become a man with a family and responsibilities, and decided that he was trying to live an upright life for a while. Indeed, he and his small family, his wife and son, moved to a new place far away from their old neighborhood, and he worked for a while as an accountant for one of the small companies. Things were quiet during this short period, but a person like Al Capone can't have a quiet or normal life. What happened not long after that was that his father passed away due to a heart attack. Naturally, Al Capone returned to Brooklyn, where his family lived, to attend the funeral, but when he saw his family's situation, and knew that his father's death would make them live in a very difficult situation, he knew that they needed him more than ever before. For Al Capone, the family is sacred. He couldn't let them suffer and go back to his wife and son, and live his normal, calm life, as if nothing had happened. He couldn't abandon his mother and his 8 siblings, and they needed him. Although he was not the eldest brother and was the 4th, he took it upon himself to help his family in this difficult time that they were going through. But at the same time, his small job as an accountant and the low salary he got wouldn't be enough for his family. He needed a different way, and here, he had no option but to go back to the gangs and illegal businesses. When Al Capone decided that he would return to gang business, he went to his leader and great inspiration, Johnny Torrio, who in turn welcomed his return and was happy about it. Johnny Torrio, at the time, was operating under the patronage of a major mafia leader named Big Jim Colosimo. Big Jim was a leader of the highest caliber in the U.S. The top business he was working in was concentrated on gambling and prostitution in Chicago. So Johnny Torrio moved to Chicago to work for Big Jim and invited Al Capone to join him and move from New York to Chicago. Al Capone packed his bags, took his wife and son with him, and moved to Chicago, where he would build his history and all his glories. Al Capone was the right hand of Johnny Torrio, And Johnny Torrio was also the right hand of the great Mafia leader, Big Jim Colosimo. The gang's business was expanding greatly, and the main credit was due to Johnny Torrio and Al Capone, and their strong and fast methods of managing operations and solving any problems they faced quickly and violently, of course. And as I told you, most of the work of the Big Jim gang was concentrated in the fields of gambling and prostitution. But in 1920, America had a new law, a law that would change many things and would open a new door for the gangs through which they could make huge profits. In 1920, a law was issued prohibiting alcohol and liquor. They became considered prohibited substances in the same way as drugs. People and society were indeed completely more lenient with them, but legally they were prohibited. There were no commercial businesses in which you could operate officially. There was no way for alcohol to be available except through illegal businesses and gangs. Straight away, Johnny Torrio found it a great opportunity to be seized and wanted to get into this field as soon as possible and took control of it. But the problem was that the big leader, Big Jim, rejected the idea and told him that he was content with his business in gambling and prostitution, and he was making a great fortune out of it, so there was no need to get into another field that may cause him troubles. Shortly thereafter, Al Capone proposed the same idea to Johnny Torrio. He went to him and told him that they had to get into the business of importing and distributing liquors. It would make them a huge profit since it was banned. The demand was high, and the prices were as well. Johnny Torrio replied that he also wanted this, but he had already talked to Big Jim about the matter, and he categorically rejected the idea. Al Capone sat thinking for a while, and then said, "I got an idea." Johnny asked, "What are you going to do?" Al Capone replied, "I am going to kill Big Jim, and then you will take his position." Even Johnny Torrio was shocked at that moment. He did not expect that Al Capone might think of this idea. Big Jim is one of the biggest Mafia leaders, and no one could mess with him. But when Johnny thought about the matter and began to imagine his position and what it would be like if he were the leader of the gang and in control of the city, all these fantasies made the idea very attractive to him, and he gave Al Capone the green light to begin the operation to assassinate Big Jim. Al Capone didn't carry out the operation himself. He hired his former leader, Frankie Yale, the owner of the bar where Al Capone worked when he was living in New York. Indeed, Frankie Yale and his gang members carried out the required operation in a perfect manner and managed to assassinate the big boss, Big Jim, on May 11, 1920. After Big Jim's death, Johnny Torrio took control of things and became the new leader. He was the second man in the gang, and everything was ready and arranged to take over the place of the previous leader. Overnight, Johnny Torrio became the most powerful man in Chicago, and of course, since Al Capone was his right-hand man, he naturally would be the second most powerful man in Chicago, even though he was only 21. Johnny Torrio and Al Capone's gang was called the Outfit Gang. Although they were the largest gang in Chicago, they did not have absolute control over all areas of the city. Chicago is a large city, and it had many gangs and parties that disputed over it. At that time, Chicago witnessed the bloodiest period in its history. Conflicts did not stop between gang members, and each one tried to impose greater hegemony and control over different regions. However, with all this violence, Johnny Torrio wanted to turn to organized crime more. This is the style of the Mafia gangs, business before violence, so he was always trying to reduce Al Capone's violent disputes and tried to teach him to deal with matters more diplomatically. He wanted him to use intelligence over strength and not always resort to violence, except when this was the last solution. Al Capone learned many of these things from his leader, Johnny Torrio, thinking wisely and thinking rationally. As was planned, the gang had strongly gotten into the field of liquor export and distribution, and this field became the most profitable for them. Al Capone began to use more wise methods for dealing with problems. He gave up resorting to violence immediately and started using more diplomacy in dealing with others. Much of this diplomacy was bribes. Many officials and police in Chicago were corrupt and accepted bribes, and even those who do not like to take bribes and have consciences are most likely afraid and would agree in the end to take the bribe. This allowed Johnny Torrio and Al Capone's gang to impose greater control over the city and on the field of the export and distribution of illicit liquor in particular. As Al Capone's status quickly rose, he began to develop a bad habit, the habit of showmanship. He did not want people to see him as a criminal or a gangster. He only wanted to look famous and brag about himself, his wealth, and his status in front of people. Of course, for someone who works in this field, this is a big mistake. He always loved to wear the most luxurious suits and jewelry. One of his most famous things was a diamond ring worth $50,000 that he wore on his pinky finger. He was a person who loved appearances and loved to show off his wealth. He loved to appear as a great, wealthy leader, and this thing, of course, attracted more attention to him than necessary. And the more his gang's activities expanded, the more the charges against him increased. Whenever he was accused of a crime, he used to hold a press conference to deny the charges against himself just because he liked to show off, he liked to brag about himself, and he liked to appear like this in front of the public. Of course, he was trying to hide some things. I mean, for example, in public, he would appear that he is an ordinary merchant to hide his criminal and illegal actions. So he had furniture stores that functioned as an official front for his illegal businesses. Although everyone knew that this was just a fake front, no one was able to speak. Either they were afraid or they were bribed, and no one could say anything or speak against him in any way. What helped him improve his reputation was that he was in the role of Robin Hood, the person who helps the needy and the poor. He was always distributing his money to less fortunate people. Whenever he went to a restaurant, bar, or other place, those who worked in that place would receive more tips than their salaries for a whole month. I mean, he was known for being generous, but most likely he was doing all these things for appearances, and then because he had a lot of money. Many people only saw this nice side of him, but even these people most likely knew about his criminal nature. Al Capone, along with his leader John Torrio, continued to expand the size of their gang's business, and their monthly income reached more than $100 million from their various businesses in the fields of exporting and distributing prohibited goods, as well as the fields of gambling and prostitution. But this was 100 years ago. Do you know how much this amount is worth today? Approximately $1.3 billion. But with all these huge numbers, this was just the beginning of Al Capone's empire. After a while, Johnny Torrio decided to expand more, mainly in the rural areas around Chicago, especially since in the center of the city, the government and police began to tighten their grip on them a little more. As for the rural areas around the city, they were much easier to control, and there were also a large number of people living there, which meant a lot of profits to be made. They could also be more comfortable areas to attract people to, even from the city, areas where the federal government would not harass them greatly. This expansion of rural areas would be the key to huge and new wealth beyond the wealth they were obtaining. During that period, Al Capone decided to move his large family, his mother and siblings, from New York City to Chicago so that they could live with him. In fact, he moved them to a large and luxurious house, and they lived a better life. After that, he also included his two brothers, the ones who were older than him, Ralph and Frank, in the gang's operations, and they became his direct assistants, and he began to depend on them in many matters. In 1923, greed and envy began to grow, especially on the part of the other gangs. They wanted a larger share of the cake, especially in the field of distributing illicit liquor, and with the attempts of these gangs to expand and enter outfit gang areas, Al Capone and John Torrio's gang, major acts of violence occurred in Chicago between these gangs. That year, 1923, was one of the bloodiest years in the entire history of Chicago. It was the year of what is known as the Beer Wars. Armed operations everywhere, assassinations, bombs exploding here and there, continuous conflicts without stopping, and continuous bloodshed. But the end was that the enemies of Johnny Torrio and Al Capone were always the losers. In 1924, things finally calmed down a little and became stable, and Johnny Torrio and Al Capone were in excellent control of things. Things calmed down to the point that Johnny Torrio decided to return to Italy for a while to take care of his sick mother, and left things completely under Al Capone's management, even though Al Capone was the leader of most operations of the gang. But this time, he was the absolute leader and the most powerful man in the city. During that period, estimates indicate that approximately 60% of the officials and police forces in Chicago were all in Al Capone's pocket. This man had unnatural control over the city. He imposed his influence everywhere and on everyone. And of course, for this thing to continue, he must always be certain that the election results go to the benefit of the officials in his pocket. Imagine that the arrogance in them reached the point that his brothers, Frank and Ralph, used to go to the election committees and mess with the votes as they wanted. They put in fake votes. They bribed voters. They threatened them. They replaced the ballot boxes. They did anything they wanted. And no one could speak up. The people were either afraid or bribed. There was no other option. If there is, they would be dead immediately. However, the events of these elections did not end well. Many people were very angry about what happened, so they went to a judge named Edmund Jiraki and asked him to solve the issue. How dare they mess with the elections in this way? This judge ordered 70 policemen to go to Caesar's town Incognito, meaning in civilian clothes or normal clothes. The town of Caesarus was one of the remote areas that the Al Capone gang took complete control of. It was one of their strongholds, where his brothers were doing what they wanted freely. They were messing with the elections, and many violent acts were taking place because of this. These undercover policemen entered the town in their regular clothes and were distributed in different places to reduce the riots. In front of one of the election committees, the police spotted Frank Al Capone, the older brother of Al Capone. Frank was not there alone. He was walking with a small group of their gang. The police began following and watching them to see if they were going to cause a problem or a riot or something like that. But it seems that Frank and the group that was with him noticed them and thought that they were members of another gang intending to attack them. So Frank and the group that was with him took out their pistols and immediately started shooting the undercover police officers. And suddenly an army of policemen who were sitting in their cars around the area appeared and showered them with a stream of bullets and executed them in their place. Frank Al Capone died, and his death was one of the things that made a big change in Al Capone's life. The death of his big brother in this way affected him greatly. Of course, he was not able to take revenge directly because there was no specific person who shot and killed him. These were policemen, and if he killed a policeman, he would put himself in trouble. But the anger that was inside him should have been discharged. Al Capone once again turned into a very violent person after the death of his brother. For a while, he tried to follow the instructions of his leader, Johnny Torrio, and be calmer in his dealings with matters and problems. But after the death of his brother, he returned to violence even stronger than before. For example, there was a problem between him and an Irish man in one of the bars. This Irish man was also a gangster and wanted to borrow money. He wanted to take a loan from one of Al Capone's men. When Al Capone's man refused to give him the loan, the Irishman, whose name was Howard, beat him. He beat Al Capone's henchman. So when Al Capone saw his man was beaten, he asked him, and the latter told him what happened. Then, Al Capone took the matter upon himself to go personally to that Irish man whose name was Howard and scold him for what he did. For this reason, Al Capone asked his men to identify the location of that Irish man, and when they did so, they found him in a bar. Al Capone went himself to that bar and met the Irish man, Howard, and asked him for an explanation for what he did. Howard gave Al Capone a look of disdain and insulted him with a vulgar word. Al Capone was surprised because no one had ever dared to insult him before. Then he straightaway pulled out his pistol and gave him a shot in the head in front of a large number of the witnesses who were present in the bar. To this extent, Al Capone didn't care about anything. It was normal for him to kill in front of people in cold blood, and he was sure that no one could speak a word. Indeed, suddenly, all of the witnesses who were there had a loss of memory when the police were investigating the crime, and none of them could remember, as if nothing had happened. No one could speak a word against Al Capone. This entire city was completely under his control. As we said, most people are afraid or bribed, and the third option is death. After a short period, the big leader, Notorious, returned from Italy. When he saw the situation and knew what had happened to Al Capone, and that he had returned to violence more than before, he tried hard again to get him back on the right path. Notorious' return at that time was a good thing for everyone. God knows what would have happened and what Al Capone would have done if he continued the wave of anger caused by his brother's death. Things remained quiet and stable for a while, but less than a year later, specifically in 1925, there was an attempt to eliminate the leader, Notorious, by another gang. This attempt was about to succeed, but he miraculously survived it. After investigations into the incident, the police found some prohibited items in Notorious' possession, because of which he was imprisoned for 9 months. During these 9 months, of course, Al Capone took leadership again, but this time things were different. This time, everyone felt that the leadership was completely in Al Capone's hands and that he had become the real leader of the gang. Even Notorious, after he had finished his sentence and got out of prison after 9 months, felt that it was time to retire and leave the world of crime and gangs, and then Al Capone officially became the successor to Notorious. Since 1926, Al Capone has been the undisputed king of Chicago, although he was only 26. As he took full control of the city, violence increased significantly. Al Capone returned to his brutal methods in dealing with any problem he faced. Anyone who did not agree with him would be eliminated by force. Al Capone in that period had guards and protection stronger than the protection of President Calvin Coolidge himself, the American president at the time, because he knew that if he lowered his defenses at any moment, his enemies would attack him directly. The car that Al Capone was using was a luxurious Cadillac that had been modified to be fully armored. We can even consider it a fly rather than a car, due to its heavy armor. It weighed nearly 6 tons. Its windows were also bulletproof, and even the back window could open if Al Capone's men needed it to shoot at their enemies from inside the car. Although Al Capone was the most powerful man in Chicago, he did not have absolute control over it, meaning most of his control was over the southern part of the city, while in the northern part, many of the areas were controlled by other rival gangs. Al Capone began to move, and little by little he took control of these northern areas. This led to stronger and more intense conflicts, and during this period a new weapon entered the battlefield of Mafia gangs, the weapon called the Tommy gun. This weapon is an automatic machine gun of the somewhat light type, and it made gang wars enter a new era of bloodshed. It was a weapon that was easy to carry and use, and could cause big and fast damage. These conflicts continued, in which Al Capone had the biggest part, and every time the authorities tried to condemn Al Capone for one of his criminal activities, their attempts went to no avail, and he got out of it easily. The matter was very easy for him. Whoever does not want to be bribed will certainly be afraid, and whoever is not afraid will be eliminated. Easy and effective steps to solve any problem or accusation directed against Al Capone. With all this violence and conflicts, Al Capone's process of running his illegal businesses was more like running a company than running a gang. There was indeed gangster business and violence, but the main focus was on organizing business management and increasing profits. It was like a business, which is why they call it organized crime. It was illegal, but they worked on it within an organized framework and structure. This aspect was bigger and more important than the gang work aspect. This is the aspect that Al Capone worked on more, but because, of course, the work of gangs and crimes creates a greater noise, we hear more about it. Al Capone used to get into many conflicts with other gangs. One of these conflicts was with a gang called the North Side Gang in Chicago, which had a great enmity with Al Capone. One day, when Al Capone and a group of his men were going to a restaurant, suddenly a convoy of 10 cars surrounded the place, full of men from the North Side Gang. They started shooting at the restaurant prolifically. The sound of gunfire echoed through the air as bullets rained down on the restaurant. The whole city heard the sound of gunfire that lasted for 10 minutes without stopping. They turned the entire restaurant into holes due to the many bullets they fired at it. It is estimated that they fired about 5,000 bullets. The very strange thing is that not a single person died during this incident. There were 5,000 bullets in one place, all of them concentrated on this restaurant, and not a single person died. But only one person was injured, and Al Capone took care of his treatment. Of course, everyone was lying down on the ground when the shooting started, but it is reasonable that the members of that gang all kept shooting above without thinking of shooting the ground. Briefly after this incident, Al Capone remained persistent in getting rid of this gang, and he was able to kill its leader. But of course, this gang did not disband as the leader died, and a new man named Bugs Moran took leadership. Conflicts continued between Al Capone and Bugs Moran, the new leader of the North Side Gang. This gang continued to engage in skirmishes and steal some of Al Capone's loads of liquor. After a while, Al Capone decided that it was the turn of the new leader, Bugs Moran, and that it was time to get rid of him. This decision would lead to one of the most famous crimes attributed to Al Capone, the crime known as the Valentine's Day Massacre. It was called this because it happened on the date of February 14, 1929, meaning Valentine's Day. But unlike the gifts that are exchanged on this day, which were chocolate and nice things, on this day, Al Capone decided to give Bugs Moran and his gang a gift of bullets coated in blood. But fortunately for Bugs Moran, he arrived late for his gift. On that day, Al Capone's men were setting up an ambush for Bugs Moran and his gang members in one of their warehouses. Two of Al Capone's men entered the warehouse while disguised as policemen and ordered the Bugs Moran gang members who were inside the warehouse to turn their backs to them and line up on the walls without any movement. Of course, the gang members who were in the warehouse, who were 7 in number, thought that this was just a regular police raid. So they obeyed the orders, raised their hands on the wall without moving, and turned their backs. At this moment, 2 more of Al Capone's men entered in ordinary clothes, and with the 2 men who were disguised in police uniforms, they opened fire on Bugs Moran's men. The 7 who were lined up were shot fired in their place immediately. They fired about 70 bullets to kill 7 people a few meters away from them. This operation, despite its bloodiness, was technically considered a failure because the main goal was to get rid of the gang leader, Bugs Moran, and it is believed that Al Capone's men thought that the last person to enter the warehouse was Bugs Moran, but he was not there. He was supposed to arrive at the warehouse earlier, but he was late for some reason, and fortunately, this delay saved his life. Of course, this massacre made headlines everywhere. The death of 7 people in this way was shocking to the entire city, especially since the acts of violence had subsided during the recent period. The finger of blame was directed at Al Capone, but Al Capone had his calculations and was traveling to the state of Florida so that he would have an alibi in case anyone tried to accuse him of this crime. But after this bloody, violent massacre, Al Capone became under the authorities' radar. In 1930, Al Capone became classified by the FBI as public enemy number 1. The federal government was trying in various ways and means to accuse him of anything, but he was always able to get out of any charge. They couldn't get enough evidence against him, even though everyone knew about his crimes. Finally, after many attempts, they were able to prove a single charge against him, but it was not a charge of a crime, nor an accusation of his illegal actions, but rather a charge of evading the payment of taxes. But despite all this, they knew that Al Capone would have a way to get out of this charge, and the method they expected that he would use was bribery and intimidation of the members of the jury who would be responsible for issuing the verdict against him in a courtroom. And indeed, Al Capone was able to reach every one of them to bribe them or intimidate them so that they would rule in his favor. But the judge made a very smart move on the day of the trial. The judge changed all the members of the jury. This change was sudden and without any prior notification. Here, there was a new jury in front of Al Capone, and he did not know any of them. The trial began, and the charge of evading the payment of taxes was proven against him. The judge issued a ruling to imprison him for 11 years, which is considered the strongest sentence issued against a person on this charge in history. The charge of evading the payment of taxes. Usually, the sentences on these charges are less than that. But the judge, of course, issued this ruling because he knew the nature of Al Capone's crimes, but at the same time, he was unable to give a life sentence on such a charge. Indeed, Al Capone was imprisoned in 1931 at the age of 32, but his imprisonment did not make him completely cut off from his gang members. On the contrary, he kept running his empire to a large extent, even from behind bars. After the officials saw that things were going this way, they decided in 1934 that they would send him to Alcatraz prison, the prison that we talked about in a previous video, the prison that was built on a small island surrounded by water from every direction, and which was believed to be the most fortified prison in the world, until, of course, the great escape that we talked about in a previous video took place. When Al Capone entered Alcatraz prison, he entered a completely new world of isolation. No one knew him, and it was impossible for him to have any contact with the outside world. This is the prison where the inmates cannot even dream of the outside world. But Al Capone's end was not at Alcatraz prison. In fact, his end was worse. Because of Al Capone's whims and his relationships with prostitutes and others, a sexual disease called syphilis was transmitted to him. This disease usually, if discovered early, can be treated with easy methods, but its problem is that it is not always discovered. This disease may be present in the human body and remain dormant in the body for many years until it gets activated suddenly. This was the case with Al Capone. The disease was not apparent until he was in Alcatraz prison. And here, the disease had entered advanced stages, and its treatment had become no simpler. When the disease spread, it began to destroy brain cells, causing damage to Al Capone's entire mind. In 1939, as his mental condition deteriorated, Al Capone was transferred from Alcatraz prison to a less secure prison in order to receive better medical care. Then in the same year, he was released, even though he still had 2 years remaining on his sentence, but they released him due to the deterioration of his mental state. In addition to the fact that he could do nothing even if he wanted to, he wasn't a source of danger anymore as he was. The doctor's latest diagnosis indicated that Al Capone's mental level had reached the level of that of a 12-year-old child, meaning his condition had deteriorated very severely. He continued to suffer from this disease for the rest of his life until he died in 1947 at the age of 48 due to a heart attack. How tragic and despicable his end was compared to the great criminal life that he lived. However, his reputation and history continue to resonate to this day, as he became one of the most famous historical figures to have ever passed through the world. We have come to the end of our story. I hope you like it, so don't forget to like and subscribe. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next video.